Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is a training introduction course on beetles, bugs and other insects. And hopefully some of you, if not all of you, will be joining me on Saturday for the field course side of it, when hopefully we'll see some of these amazing animals in the flesh. Before we start, I'm going to ask Nesta from the City Council just to say a few words about Saving the Saffron Brook project, which is kind of behind this series of events. So Nesta, do you want to say a few words?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, great. So I'm Nesta. I'm working on the Saving the Saffron Brook project, which is it's a partnership project. So I work for the City Council, but we're working with local organisations, so Nature Spot being one of them, Night and Wild, who are another local wildlife group. We're working with the Trent Rivers Trust, who are experts in river restoration. And we're working on along the catchment of the Saffron Brook, which some of you might know as the Wash Brook, which runs from Oadby into Knighton, through the city and through Saffron Lane, and then joins the River Soar. And we've got a sort of double objective to the project. So one being ecological inputs. So the river itself has become quite unnatural. In places it's polluted, in places it's a concrete channel and runs underground, or is quite degraded in terms of habitat and the ecology that can live there. So our partners, Trent Rivers Trust, are working to restore the habitats there, not only in the river, so there's things we can do in the river to make it more natural and more of a home for wildlife, but also linking up the green spaces that sit along the river. So in Knighton Park, in Brox Hill, in Oadby, in the Washbrook Nature Area in Saffron Lane, we're looking at creating grasslands and wetlands and ponds and woodlands, which are all part of that network of natural habitats that plants and animals can move along and thrive in. And as we all know, sort of wildlife at the moment more than ever needs a bit of help, especially in urban environments, to really thrive. Excuse me. The other arm of the project is events like these, and guided walks and play dates for children, and family events that we're running, which are to really enable people to come out and engage with the wildlife in the brook and alongside the brook, and to see nature in a different way, I think. And hopefully what will happen tonight is that we'll learn about some of these beetles and bugs and tiny things that you might disregard and walk past on your daily walk. And we can learn to sort of pay a bit more attention and really recognize and encourage and appreciate that diversity that is in our parks, in our gardens, in our green spaces. So yeah, we're working to enhance the wildlife that's around, and we're working to bring people out and to appreciate the wildlife that's around as well. Yeah, that's all from me. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Nesta.
Thanks.
I just wanted to also mention that if you're not aware of it, or you've not currently signed up for it, Nature Sport, in partnership with Saving the Saffron Brook, are running this challenge to anybody that wants to participate, to challenge you to identify 100 different species that you can find in Leicestershire or Rutland. So you may feel that will be easy, you may feel it's difficult, but why not give it a go? So you can sign up for nothing on the Nature Sport website. So let's get stuck into it then. So beetles and bugs are two groups of insects. So we're going to concentrate on those two groups, but we'll also touch on a few others. I was just amused earlier when I saw on a well-known online shopping site this for sale, 36 pack of large plastic insects. And so I thought I'd challenge you to identify how many are not insects on that list. Hopefully you might gather fairly quickly that the two bats aren't insects. But does anybody want to hazard a guess what the others are that are not insects? So of the 36, there are 6 that are not insects. There's 2 bats and 4 arachnids, 3 spiders and a scorpion. The scorpion is an arachnid related to the spiders. So that begs the question, really, doesn't it? What is an insect? And how are you going to recognize it? So because there's so many and there's such a kind of a variety of shapes and sizes, it's quite difficult in some ways to generalize. But all insects have 3 body segments. They have the head, the thorax, the chest, if you like, and then the abdomen. And you could compare that with spiders and other arachnids that only have 2 because the head and the thorax are fused together. But the other key difference is the number of legs. So insects have 3 pairs of legs. They're all jointed, but they share that with all other arthropods. And generally, they all have this hard exoskeleton, which you may think, well, not everything has a hard case-like external appearance, but what it means is they don't have an internal skeleton like we do. So all of their internal organs are basically hung off the outside. So as I mentioned, insects are such a huge group. In fact, they are probably the most successful group in the world in terms of a single taxonomic group that has evolved to fill so many niches. So in the UK alone, we have around about 25,000 species. So where do you start? There are so many. I mean, in many ways, that's the beauty of it. There's just so many new things to find out. But as Nesta said, a lot of them are quite small, so they're easy to ignore. But if you take the time and perhaps invest in a lens or just look at things close up, there's some absolutely amazing animals out there. So we're going to start with beetles, which is one of the 2 biggest groups of insects, the other one being flies. And we'll touch on flies later, but we're going to concentrate on beetles. So with all these insects and all this variety, if you're going to try and work out what species you're looking at, then the first thing is to try and narrow the field. You don't want to be looking through 25,000 different potential species. So first of all is kind of what type of insect it is, what group does it fall into? So if it's a beetle, how are you going to recognize it's a beetle and say not a bug or some other type of insect? So beetles, because there are so many, are also hugely varied, but in general, they all have a hardened pair of wing cases. So all of the insects have 2 pairs of wings. Well, most do. There's a few that have lost their wings, but the majority have 2 pairs of wings, although in some groups, the front pair has been adapted, and that is the case with beetles. So in this case, the front pair of wings has become hard and shiny and effectively forms the cases for the main functional wings, which lie underneath the hind pair. So looking at this beetle here, it can fly. It doesn't look like it. So it lifts up these wing cases. You can see there's a division down the middle, and they hinge at the front, and then the wings will appear. In many cases, they are folded, like a kind of almost origami-like, and then they pump their body fluids into the wings to straighten them out, and then they're in a position to fly. So as I say, most beetles have the wing cases covering the whole abdomen, so they look quite, armored, I suppose. But there is a group of beetles that don't follow that rule, and we'll touch on those later, the rove beetles, where the wing cases don't go right to the back of the abdomen. They're very much shortened, almost like it's wearing a cape. And in this case, the wings are definitely folded. The wings themselves would probably extend beyond the length of the abdomen, or at least to the end of it. But they're very cleverly folded and tucked under these wings. If you ever get the chance to see a rove beetle and you want to encourage it to fly, just marvel at how they unpack those wings. So even within beetles alone, there's 102 families, over 4,000 species. In Leicestershire and Rutland, we reckon that there are just over 2,000 species to be found here. So an awful lot of different beetles to look at. So carrying on to kind of narrow the field, I'm not going to go through all 100 families, but I'm just going to flag a few up, because if you can recognize the family, the type of beetle it is, then it makes it a lot easier to try and work out what it is you're looking at. So here's a few of the kind of perhaps more prominent families. So obviously the diving beetles are largely found in water, but they're not restricted to water. Most of them are pretty good flyers. This is an adaptation to migrate from pond to pond. Ponds always run the danger of drying out. So if you're a water beetle, how do you find a new home? So they're very good colonizers. And if anybody's built a pond in their garden, you may know that it very quickly can get colonized by beetles. And some of them will colonize just temporary pools, like puddles, basically, where there might be wheel ruts. So they're very good at flying, but they're also hugely streamlined, which can allow them to move through the water very quickly. They do breathe air, so they have to come to the surface to refresh their air supply. There are several types of diving beetles, but the best known are the Ditiscidae, and this includes the great diving beetle, which is this one we're looking at, which is one of our largest beetles. Another one which is quite colourful, and you may see it if you ever come across a dead rabbit or something on a walk. If you dare to turn it over, you may well see this beetle. It's a carrion beetle, member of the Sylphidae family. We mentioned the rogue beetle having these kind of cloak-like wing cases, so they're quite easy to recognise because of that, but there's a lot of species in that group. The click beetles you often come across on vegetation, and they get their name because where the abdomen meets the thorax, there's a kind of a peg and a socket. And what they do is they put the peg into the socket and then put the whole thing under tension. And if they need to escape, they can release the tension, and a bit like an elastic band, and they literally will ping into the air, because the abdomen and the thorax bend very quickly, and it makes an audible click, hence the name. Weevils you may recognise by their long snout, elephant-like rostrum at the beginning. That's part of their mouthparts. That's a rigid part of their mouth, their face really, and the antennae sticking out of that. There are other types of weevils that don't have such an obvious snout, but they all have this extended nose-like protuberance at the front. And one of the biggest groups, and one that you may come across most often, are the ground beetles, the crabids. Most of them are black and not that colourful. Many of them live under stones or under cover. So if you lift up a log or a stone, you may see one. But this one, you may see running around paths and the like when it's sunny. They're much more active during the day. Most ground beetles are quite voracious hunters, and they chase down their prey. They're very quick movers. And then another group, just to flag up, are the soldier beetles. They get their name because they are quite colourful, often kind of red, yellow, orangey colours with black markings, and they kind of I suppose resemble the old military uniforms from previous times. And there's one which we'll see in a minute, a particular type of soldier beetle, which is probably the commonest beetle around at the moment. You go for a walk anywhere, you're going to see it. But let's start with ladybirds. Ladybirds are beetles, of course, have this kind of hard shell covering their wings. And most people are familiar with the 7-spot ladybird, which is possibly our commonest or equal commonest. And as it says on the tin, it has 7 spots, 3 on each side, and this big central spot here in the middle. It used to be equally common with the 2-spot ladybird, which generally has 2 spots, but there are other variants, but we won't get into that. But the 2 spot has become much less common because of the harlequin ladybird, which we'll talk about in a minute. The 14 spot, you wouldn't know it had 14 spots. They barely look like spots, but it's the commonest yellow and black ladybird, and you see it quite frequently amongst vegetation, and it looks a bit like a checkerboard, doesn't it, with the spots turned into squares, really. So these are all, I'd say, the 7 commonest ladybirds. Well, there's an 8th one, which is the harlequin, that you're likely to come across. The pine ladybird you particularly find earlier in the spring, but it's very round, and it has these comma marks on it. And I think it's the only one that has these clear comma marks, and with that shape, certainly. The 16 spot is also very common, but it's also very small, so it's easily overlooked. It's only, what, about 5 millimeters or so, but you sometimes find them in their hundreds. They congregate in very large numbers, particularly in the spring. And another one which you may come across, but is also small, often easily confused with the pine, being black with these red spots, but it has this kind of flange around the outside, which also helps to identify it. And then the orange ladybird is orange, but it particularly not only has a kind of a reddy orange, these wing cases here, but has an orange pronotum and an orange head, in fact. So you may well come across all of those on a walk, particularly earlier in the year, but the one you're almost certainly going to come across is the harlequin ladybird. So this, as you may know, is an invasive species. It arrived in Leicestershire in about 1990, and it spread across the whole world. It's originally from Asia and then was imported or taken into the United States for pest control purposes. And it, as often happens, it ultimately expanded from the place it was originally introduced to and has since spread all over the world. And it's called a harlequin ladybird because it doesn't come in one set color or pattern. And all of these are harlequin ladybirds. There are more varieties. I think there's about 20 recognized forms, and you may come across any of them. Some of them are a little bit more common than others, but they're also quite a large ladybird, so that helps to recognize it. And the common feature that they all tend to have are these big white spots on the front of the thorax. So this kind of scaly part of the exoskeleton that covers the thorax is called a pronotum. And in this case, you can see it has these 2 almost like big headlights on the front, and they all tend to have that. So the combination of the large size and those big white patches helps to pick it out. But it's also worth looking out for the larva of this harlequin ladybird. It is quite distinctive in that it has these kind of orange stripes down the sides. There are other ladybird larvae out there that you may encounter, but none of them have these clear orange stripes. And the other thing which you might see and not realize what they are, particularly if you look on bushes, low-hanging branches on trees, for example, this is the pupa. So when the larva is ready to metamorphosize into the adult, a bit like a butterfly or a moth, it turns into a pupa, and then the whole body shape changes within that capsule, and it will emerge ultimately as the adult. Incidentally, when ladybirds first emerge, they don't have these colors or these bright patterns. It takes a little while for those to form. So sometimes you come across a very kind of pale, washed out ladybird that doesn't seem to fit with any species that you would know about, and it most commonly is because it's only recently hatched out. So let's look at some other kind of common beetles that you may well come across I mentioned one of the soldier beetles that is super common at the moment. I was out this afternoon, and virtually everywhere I looked, I could see quite a number of them. So these kind of bright, kind of red, shiny beetles with black tips to their wing cases. They like to sit on flowers, but also they'll climb all over the vegetation. So you should easily spot that one, particularly this time of year. The other one, which has become very common, and you find it visiting flowers because it will eat the nectar and the pollen of the flower, is the swollen-thighed beetle. A great name, which is very descriptive of the male. The male is on the left, and you can see why it's called the swollen-thighed beetle. The female, on the other hand, shown on the right, doesn't have that feature, but is also kind of this metallic green color. And typically, its wing cases don't shut, they kind of gape at the back. So once you see that, and it's quite a decent size, that helps to identify. But the males can't really be mixed up with anything else. And then another one that you might come across, where I think is a lovely beetle, the cardinal beetle, bright red, and the male has these kind of antler-like antennae. And it's, well, not so much found on flowers, but it likes to sunbathe. So it'll often crawl out onto leaves or vegetation in the sun, particularly in the morning. So we mentioned the ground beetles. Many of them are quite hard to identify because they all look very similar. But this is one of the commonest, and fortunately, it's also one of the easier ones to identify if you look carefully at the shape of the pronotum on its thorax. And you see how evenly rounded, it's almost circular. And that combined with its size, it's about 1.5 centimeters long. It's quite a big beetle, makes it easy to identify. There are some color variants that have red tops of their legs. This one has a hint of it. Some of them, they're bright cherry red. So don't be distracted from that. It's the same beetle, it's just a variant. And the other one, which is pretty common, but it's quite small, the very carpet beetle. It likes to visit flowers. I have hundreds in my garden, if you look carefully in some of the flowers. So because it's quite strikingly colored, if you look in detail, you may wonder what that is. So the varied carpet beetle. You may also find it in your house, because although in the wild it will naturally, the larva will feed on wool and feathers, a kind of organic material, and it's commonly found in birds' nests. It will also eat wool carpets, so it turns up in houses, and then as it hatches out, the beetles will fly to the light, and so they end up on the window and then possibly die. You might find these dead on the windowsill. So let's just look in detail at one or two other groups. I flagged up the leaf beetles because these are some of the commonest beetles you come across. Not on the flowers, but as the name suggests, on the leaves. Most of them eat the leaves of varying flowers, and there's many of them that are quite specialist to eat specific types of flowers, and that very much helps to identify them. If you can work out what type of plant it's on, then that's a strong pointer to what insect you're looking at. So this one, the rosemary beetle, is quite stunning if you get the light on it with these kind of blues and purple and red stripes. I find it in my garden, also on lavender as well as on rosemary. So this, moving over, is the tortoise beetle, and it does look very rounded and compact, and it has this ability, like a tortoise, to tuck all of its legs and its antennae under the shell, and it clamps up tight on the stems, and it's quite flat, so it's quite a good defense. This one you often find on thistles. And one to look out for, which is quite easy to spot and to identify, is the willow flea beetle. As the name suggests, you find it on willows. So if ever you come across a willow, just have a look on the leaves that you can see. It's quite small, but it's called a flea beetle because it a bit like that swollen thigh beetle, but they serve a different purpose. Here, the back legs of the beetle are enlarged, and it has this amazing ability to jump flea-like, and it's an escape mechanism. So if they're threatened, they just ping off the leaf. But this combination of metallic green and the metallic red on the front, and the fact that you find it on willows would help you identify it. If you've got lilies growing in your garden, from now on, look out for this one. It's hard to miss with this colour, isn't it? The kind of scarlet lily beetle. Many gardeners don't like it because it can damage lily plants, but it's quite a spectacular beetle to come across. And this one on the bottom right isn't so common, but I've just put it in because occasionally come across it, and it's quite a large beetle, certainly for the leaf beetles. But as the name suggests, it emits this red body fluid from its face if it's threatened, and it's an adaptation designed to put off predators such as birds and so on. And I imagine it tastes pretty vile. Oh, I can't sound ever try tasting it. So just a few of the beetles just to look out for. They're not necessarily very common, but they're absolutely stunning if you come across them. So the wasp beetle is an interesting example because it's mimicking a wasp with the yellow stripes on a black surrounding, but it goes beyond that. If ever you see it, you sometimes see it on fence posts or tree trunks. I've seen it. It actually moves like a wasp, quite jerky movements. So that's a great one to look out for. And this one is our certainly our biggest terrestrial beetle. We don't get the stag beetles that you may have seen in magazines and so on, with the huge projections at the front. This is it's related, but it doesn't have such large pincers at the front. And these are used by the males for basically for wrestling other males, and it's part of their their fight for the right to mate, I suppose, to defend a patch and to push other males away. But it's unmistakable, really. It's big and it's quite squat and rounded, particularly with the males. These pincers at the front. And I don't know whether you've come across this one. It looks quite scary sometimes. The devil's coach horse. It's another quite large beetle, and it's a road beetle. You can see the short wing cases here. But like a number of the road beetles, it has the habit, when it's threatened, of curling up the abdomen over the back. I don't know whether it's pretending to be a scorpion or why it does that. But it will open its jaws, and they are major predators of other insects, particularly not of humans. So there's nothing for us to worry about. But it does look quite scary when it's in that position. And then finally, the green tiger beetle is an absolutely amazing little beetle. It hunts along paths, so sometimes you do come across it. You can find it at Bradgate Park on the paths leading up to Old John and one or two other sites. It likes to be out in the sun, and it kind of it just looks for prey, and then it flies very quickly and pounces on them. And again, it's got really powerful jaws. So yeah, if you see any of those, then it's a good day. So let's move on to bugs, the other major group we're going to look at today. So it's also a large group with lots of variation. So what they have in common is they don't have jaws as such. They all have their mouth parts formed into like a tube-like beak, almost like a needle. And most of them use that, they push it into plants in order to suck out the plant juices, and that's what they feed on. And most of them, although not all of them, they have the base of their forewings, remember they have two pairs of wings, which is quite leathery. So it's not turned into a hard protective case like we saw on the Beetles, but it serves a kind of purpose. But on most bugs, you see the wings sticking out at the bottom like this. So as we did with the Beetles, let's look at some of the common groups that you may come across. This isn't comprehensive, it's just a selection. So again, if you want to identify what you've found, it's always useful if you can try and pin down the kind of insect and ultimately the type of bug that you're looking at. So the shield bugs we'll look at in a little bit more detail in a minute. This is a really good group if you want to kind of get into insects. The shield bugs are a good group to study because there's not too many of them. They're all quite large and colourful. The lace bugs are not so easy to find. They're quite common, and many of them are specialists, but they're just amazing if you do find them. They tend to live on specific host plants. So there is one that is a specialist feeder on creeping thistle, and another different species that's a specialist feeder on spear thistle. So often with spear thistle, I'll take the time to search for one, and if you search hard enough, you nearly always find them, often on the stems. Other bugs that you sometimes come across are the damsel bugs. They are predatory, so they will not just, they don't feed so much on plant matter, but they will hunt down prey, small little insects, and they stick their beak-like mouth parts into that poor insect and suck out the juices from that insect. There are several damsel bugs, but they all have that similar shape, kind of narrow at the front, narrow head, and quite long legs. Ground bugs, as you may gather from the name, tend to be found on the ground or sometimes on low vegetation. This is the nettle ground bug, probably the commonest of them. But maybe the one that you'll come across most often, or the group that you come across, are the plant bugs in the family Miridae. Almost every plant that you'll come across this time of year will have some on. Nettles are great plants to search for bugs. There's quite a few species that support these kind of bugs. We'll come on to those in a minute. But there are quite a few that live in water. A bit like the Beetles, they're specialist. Some live within the water, some live on top of the water. But again, we'll have another quick look at the variety of those in a minute. And then there are the hoppers, leaf hoppers, plant hoppers, that have a completely different shape, almost very squat, almost kind of like frog-like, really. And indeed, that's what gives some of them their name, the frog hoppers. And then I'm sure you're all familiar with aphids or greenfly, of which there are many, many species. Some of them, being small, are quite hard to identify, but a few of them are, if you look closely enough, you can quite easily identify them to species. So let's have a quick look at the shield bugs. I mentioned that they're a good place to start. All of these that we're looking at now are pretty common. You may well have some in your garden if you've got any kind of garden at all, really. The green shield bug, as the name suggests, is all green, although like many of these shield bugs, they overwinter as adults. And this one, well, all of them that do that, their colours fade and they take on more browny, dowdy colours, which makes sense if you think that they have to hide away over winter. They don't want to be found when it's so cold they can't crawl or fly away. So they rely on camouflage. So they take on a kind of a brownish colour that will make them blend in to the kind of dead vegetation they're hiding in. The hairy shield bug is the other very common one. It tends to be hairier when it's young. The adults, it's not so obvious. The red-legged shield bug is most commonly found in woodland, but it has this kind of dark brown red legs, as you guess, but this kind of orange tip here to the scutellum, which is this triangular thing on its back. These two, the birch shield bug and the parent shield bug, both live on birch, and quite common. The birch shield bug it is sometimes harder to find because it will often be found on the underside of leaves. But this time of year, you should be able to find the parent shield bug quite easily if you look on a birch tree. They have lots of young, and it's one of the few insects that actually looks after its young. As you can see in this picture, initially when the young hatch out from their eggs, the adult will stand over them, providing a kind of protective canopy. And then even as they grow, the adult will hang around and act as kind of a guardian. But you often find them on the seed catkins of silver birch. So yeah, have a good look for them. And the other one, as the name suggests, if you've got hawthorn or you need hawthorn, you may well find this one. It looks a little bit like the birch shield bug, and they are sometimes confused. They're a similar shape. The hawthorn shield bug has these big pointed shoulders. But one of the key differences, this scutellum, this triangular shape here, is green in the hawthorn shield bug and has red on it in the birch shield bug. So just some, I'm not necessarily expecting to remember these, but they're just some tips to point out that if you do come across these, sometimes it's just these little subtle details that you have to look for to be able to identify the species. So I mentioned the plant bugs. Here's some of the common ones that you might come across. The potato capsid, many of them are kind of called capsids. It's like a short name for this group. Okay, it's green like a lot of them are, but they have these two spots here on the front of the pronotum. This kind of hard covering over the thorax, and I think it's the only one that has those. So that's a strong pointer that you're looking at the potato capsid. This one, I think it's sometimes called the thick antenna bug, for obvious reasons perhaps. But again, it's one that is unmistakable, very dark color, but the antennae are not only thick, but they're very long. But it has these long greeny legs, and they're around at the moment. So yeah, just look on vegetation. Bugs, all of these bugs, if they see you coming, will try and just hide away, and they'll just gently slide under the leaf. If you see them hide like that, you can just put your finger on the leaf, and often that will prompt them to scurry back on top again, where you can get a better look at them. The red bug, just to confuse you, comes in a black form as well as the red form, but it's quite a large bug, and both of them have these kind of red spots here on the bits that cover up the wings. This one, bottom left, is found on nettles and is possibly the commonest bug. These three orange spots help to point it out. It also has these stripy legs. And a couple more here that are pretty common and fairly easy to find and to identify. So just a few others to point out. Some of them are very common. Some of them are less common, but quite striking. The dock bug looks a little bit like a shield bug. It's not in the shield bug family, but it's in the squash bug family, which are closely related. As the name suggests, it breeds on dock. So just search any dock that you come across, and you may well find this. They're quite large, size of a shield bug. And this time of year, they are the young are developing, and they'll often all hang around as a family group on the same leaf. So the young have a more of a kind of a banjo shape, a more rounded abdomen. But you see here on the adult how flared it is at the outside. The cinnamon bug is probably unmistakable. You'll find it on the ground, often sunning itself on low vegetation as well. Common flower bug is very, very common, but quite small, so you have to look closely for that. The chinch bug is weird looking and quite easy to identify. Nothing really looks like it. I actually wanted to mention the box bug because it has become pretty common. And it's bizarre because maybe 15, certainly 20 years ago, it was one of the most threatened insects in Britain. It was only found in a very small part of Sussex, Box Hill, where it fed or it bred on box trees. And that obviously restricted its distribution. And then for some reason, it evolved or adapted to change its diet. And it suddenly decided it could eat different types of plants, including some quite common plants, other shrubs like blackthorn and I think bramble as well. Although it will actually eat several different types of shrubs now, and that allowed it to expand. And it reached Leicestershire, I think about 12, 15 years ago. And now it's become pretty common. I find it quite often. And indeed, I found them breeding in my garden last year, which seemed amazing to me, given its past story, as I've just mentioned, how rare it was. So it looks a little bit like the dot bug, if you want to compare them, but is not flared anywhere near to the same degree at the bottom. And the one on the right is a very large but incredibly striking insect if you come across it, the Western conifer seed bug. So we'll have a quick look at the other major group of bugs, the hoppers. Some of them are very easy to identify, some of them less so. One that you can't mistake and is pretty common is this one, the red and black leafhopper. Often you find like almost dozens in the same area. If you look for them, they will be not on the flowers, but on the stems, mainly on the stems, but sometimes on the leaves of plants. Next to it is the common froghopper, but you're probably more familiar with it as cuckoo spit. So cuckoo spit is the hiding place for the larva of the common froghopper. If you ever get a little bit of this kind of frothy cuckoo spit on your finger and just open it up, just spread it around, you'll see the larva on the inside. So like all of the bugs, it pushes its mouth part into wherever it wants to feed on. In this case, the plant stem, sucks out all of those sugar-rich plant juices to feed on, but it squirts some of them out at its back end and blows bubbles at the same time, and it produces this frothy case which it lives in. So it provides a number of benefits. It hides it away, so birds and so on find it hard to find it, and then also it's quite sticky, so if they want to go hunting for it in there, they're going to get covered in the froth. But also it helps keep it moist, which is important for many insects. Now the green leaf hopper on the right is very common on anywhere that's damp. I was out this afternoon near to where I live, and there were hundreds in some damp grassland near me. Others that are quite striking on the bottom row here, potato leaf hopper is pretty common. It's not very big, but has this very striking pattern. There are others that look broadly similar, but if you can get a photo of any of these, it will certainly help you to identify. The rhododendron leafhopper is a new arrival really in Leicestershire, and as the name suggests, it's one of the very few creatures that can feed on rhododendron. So it's an example of, I think, how ultimately these invasive plants do kind of settle down into the ecosystem, and the native wildlife ultimately recognizes them as a resource, or in this case, one of its natural predators arrives here also and finds the rhododendron in huge quantities, and it's a great food source. So if you ever go anywhere where there's a lot of rhododendron, then look out for this, particularly in July and August. It's a really striking insect, as you can see. And then on the far right, this absolutely weird leafhopper. It's camouflaged to blend in with the bark of trees. So you can imagine if that's flat on the bark of a tree, particularly lichen covered trees, it's not as obvious as you think it might be. So I mentioned we'd have a quick look at some of the aquatic insects. Some of these I'm sure you've seen. The pond skater on the left, so it's one of those that sits on the top of the water. It has what are called hydrophobic hairs on its feet, which means that it repels water, and it basically allows it to skate on the surface tension. And it feels vibrations in the water of any other little insect that might have fallen in, and it will go swimming over or skating over very quickly, and then pushes its mouth parts into that insect to feed on it. These names that I've asterisked are because there are several species. So these are kind of generic names for the type of insect. There are several pond skaters that you could find in Leicestershire. And similarly, the water boatmen. So these swim under the water with these long adapted legs that look like oars, and literally it uses them to swim throughout the water course. Most of these feed on detritus, again, rotting leaves and so on at the bottom, rather than being predators. The water cricket is quite common, but is often found on slow running streams, little brooks and so on, and often in groups. Many people think it's a pond skater, but if you look carefully, it's a fatter body, not quite as long. And if you get a good view, it has these kind of red dots on it. Another one that lives under the water, but often you see at the surface, is the back swimmer. So it's a bit like a water boatman, but it swims upside down. So you sometimes see it swimming along under the surface tension, whereas the pond skater is on top of the surface. This one is often under the surface. The water measurer is a unique species. Looks a little bit like a pond skater that's been on a diet. It's really slim, with this kind of weird head here with the kind of little protruding bobble eyes on the side. And it looks, well, probably is quite delicate, as it just kind of often walks on vegetation at the edge of water. And one that looks a bit scary but is completely harmless is the water scorpion. The claws at the front to help it hunt, and this is not a sting or anything that could hurt anything really. It's actually a snorkel. It's an air tube, so it allows it to be, say, resting on vegetation beneath the surface of the water, but to stick this tube out of the water to breathe in some air. Some weird and wonderful creatures. So let's look at some other insects briefly. These are hoverflies. So it's a branch of flies that often people study these in particular because they're quite colourful, and most of them mimic bees and wasps. So this is the commonest of them all. You can find it sometimes in 10s, 20s, 30s on a single plant at certain times of year, and that's because the numbers are enhanced by migration. So given the favourable winds and weather conditions on the continent, millions of these can arrive in Britain. And it's quite easy to identify because it has these kind of moustache-shaped bars on its back. Another one that is a nice one to look out for, and is pretty common. It's nicknamed the Batman hoverfly because the black shape on its thorax here has it's a kind of a rough resemblance to the Batman icon, certainly with a bit of imagination. And sometimes it's fainter than that, but it's quite a large hoverfly, and you often find them later in the year, particularly on the ivy, when it gets to September time and most plants have died away. Ivy comes into its own in September and maybe October. And it's one of the few plants that produces nectar. So a lot of the nectar feeding insects that are around congregate on ivy. So it's always a good place to look for it. And this hoverfly is common at that time on ivy. The long hoverfly visits flowers and is quite easy to identify if you see the male quite clearly. The abdomen is very long, much longer than the length of the wings. The female isn't so obvious. So if you want to identify and ultimately record any of these, just go for males. And I've put these in because these are some of the commonest hoverflies, but they're not necessarily the easiest to identify. Not all common species are, I'm afraid. So they don't have the kind of striking yellow and black that many of the other species do, because they're not trying to mimic wasps. In this case, they are mimics, but of male bees that are called drones. So the one on the left, the common dronefly, again, you can almost see it every time you go out. It particularly likes bramble flowers, but will visit all kinds of flowers, and is quite a squat insect. And a closely related species, another dronefly, is the tapered dronefly. Now, the male of this one is quite easy to identify because, as the name suggests, the abdomen tapers off in quite a pronounced way. But there is also a way of identifying them by the colour of their front legs. And so the common dronefly, the front feet, or the tarsi, as they're called, of the insect are dark, and the same feature on the tapered dronefly is they're pale. So it's just an example again of a detail. And if you're able to take pictures, and take lots of pictures if you get a chance, because you'll find some of them have captured details that others haven't. Some of them have been focused, some haven't. And with a bit of luck, you may have captured the key feature that helps you to identify it. So a few other, I'm just going to bring all of these up actually. Insects that are quite common and relatively easy to identify. The yellow dunfly, particularly the male, visits flowers because it will feed on nectar, but it's a predator, and it's very cleverly worked out that a good place to find a meal is, the feeding place for other insects. So it'll hang around on flowers, maybe have a little nibble of nectar and pollen itself, but it's primarily looking for some other insect to land to feed that it can pounce on. So the male is very furry and clearly bright yellow. The female has less hairs and it's less obvious. This one, again, is very common this time of year on flowers, but there's a difference between the male and the female. Quite metallic looking. So we mentioned the soldier beetles. These are in a group called soldier flies, again called soldiers because of these kind of bright colours. And the bee fly you probably won't see now. It's more of a spring species, but certainly is very common in spring and so easy to identify. It hovers and it will visit flowers and feeds on nectar using this strange elongated proboscis here to suck up nectar from flowers. It's sometimes hard to see the wings when it's hovering because the wings move so quickly. But it looks a bit like a bumblebee because it's so round and furry. But it will rest on the ground or on a flower, and you get a good view of it then. Both of these two will visit flowers, and they're both common at the moment. This one you will find very commonly on ragwort. Both of these are what are called tachinid flies. It's a group of flies that parasitize caterpillars and moths primarily. And this one has these kind of red patches, and indeed the red runs underneath the abdomen. And this one is unmistakable because of its size. It's just a giant fly and has these kind of broad orange sides, but it's just so chunky with this big head. Once you've seen it, you should be able to recognize it quite easily. So just give you a quick idea of how difficult it can be to identify some common flies. So this is one I'm sure you've seen everywhere. There's probably a dozen or 20 or more in my garden this very second, visiting flowers, the green bottle. But there are quite a few. So how do you know which species it is? I'm not expecting you to remember this, but I just thought it might be interesting just to point out some of these little details that you have to look for. So you recognize this one from two key features. It has what's called a pale basicosta. The basicosta is a little scale that is right at the base of the wing. You can't see it very clearly on this photo, but again, in the right light, with a lens or a microscope, you'd see it more clearly. And then you look for some of the bristles on its legs, and this one has one bristle pointing forwards on the middle tibia. The tibia, they have three parts to their legs: the femur at the top, the tibia in the middle, and then the tarsus at the bottom, which is basically the foot. And similarly with the other very common familiar plant, the blue bottle. This also has lookalikes, but with a few key features can be identified. Insects don't breathe through their mouth. They breathe through effectively pores in their body structure. So on flies, they're often easy to see on the side. They're called spiracles. They have two at the front and two at the rear. And this is the front spiracle. And as you can see, it's bright orange. We mentioned the basicosta, this little scale at the base of the wing, it's yellow in this species. But this part of the face, which are commonly referred to as the jowls, it's basically below the eye and above the mouth, is kind of this yellow orange. So the combination of those features would tell you what it is. So if you want to get into blowflies, you've got a good start here. So looking at bees and wasps briefly, there are more bees than most people realize, but some people think there only is one bee, the honeybee, and it is true, there is only one honeybee in the UK. But there are also about 25 species of bumblebee. And these two on the top here are very common and quite easy to identify. But they look a little bit like each other. They're the only real two bumblebees that have this kind of orange furry top on the thorax here. The Carder bumblebee, which is the commonest, probably of all bumblebees, starts off with this kind of tawny fur on its abdomen, but the hairs kind of wear off, so the abdomen becomes increasingly just dark. But it never has a white tail end to its abdomen like this one does. So if you see the orange front and the white back, or the white tail, then that's a tree bumblebee. This is a species that's become very common now. It arrived again maybe 15, 20 years ago in Leicestershire. And as the name suggests, it tends not to nest underground, but nests in holes in trees. But it's adapted to take advantage of nest boxes. So you may see it nesting in a nest box if you've got one in your garden. They'll also nest in cavities under soffit boards on your house, for example. And another pretty common and relatively easy bumblebee to identify is the red-tailed bumblebee, largely all black, at least the female, the workers are, with a reddy orange tail. So wasps, there are a lot of different wasps, and a bit like the bees, we tend to recognize a few of them more so than others. So particularly with wasps, we recognize the social wasps, which are the kind of the yellow and black ones that plague our picnics. But this time of year, they are largely hunting because they are carnivorous, whereas the bees are vegetarians. And so when they're collecting food to take back to the colony for the young, they will take back insect prey. But once the colony starts to break down, they no longer have a job to do. They will at that point go off on their own. They will die later in the year, but before that, they will just look after themselves, and they will still catch food, other insects to feed on the meat, but they will also feed on sugar, junk food, if you like. So they'll visit flowers, but if there's anything sugary that's around that they can take advantage of, then they're very much attracted to it. So if you want to get to know wasps, you need to get to know them up close and personal. So you need to look a wasp in the face in order to know what species it is, because they all have unique patterns. So the common wasp has this anchor black shape on its face here. The second most common wasp, the German wasp, has a bar with the two dots beneath. Other species of wasp that look broadly similar have different face patterns. So we'll just probably finish with another common group of insects. The grasshoppers. Obviously, this is the time of year to find grasshoppers. Most of them are not quite adult yet, but they're getting there. It's August time, which is kind of peak season for grasshoppers. But at this point of the year, you'll find lots of nymphs and a few adults. So these are the common ones that you'll come across. The grasshoppers have short antennae, and the crickets and bush crickets have long antennae. The antennae often as long, if not longer, than their body. So this one is probably, the lesser marsh grasshopper is probably the commonest grasshopper in Leicestershire and Rutland. And doesn't have anything really conspicuous about it. Sometimes the grasshoppers can be a little tricky to separate, but it has two features that help point you to the species. It has, remember the pronotum, that hard shell over the thorax. It has these sharp edges, they're called keels, and they are differently patterned and differently shaped on different grasshoppers. So that's often the key feature to look for. So with the lesser marsh grasshopper, they're almost parallel, slightly flared out at the base, but also it has long wings that pretty much reach the end of the body, but it has these white line along the edge of the wing. So the combination of those features tells you it's a lesser marsh. Another common grasshopper, the meadow grasshopper, also has almost parallel keels on its pronotum, but this typically has short wings. The wings do not reach the end of the abdomen. Colours aren't necessarily a good guide to grasshoppers because there's a lot of variation. The field grasshopper, all these three at the top can turn up on any kind of grassland, particularly if it's dry grassland that gets a lot of sun, but it has these black wedges at the base of the pronotum here. It also tends to be kind of a grey colour, not so often green or brown, quite dull looking. And the green grasshopper is typically green, but not necessarily green all over, and some of the other grasshoppers can be green. But the pronotum flares out and it has these cream stripes along the edge. And I just wanted to mention this bush cricket on the right, Roselle's bush cricket. It's becoming increasingly common. Indeed, a lot of grasshoppers are becoming more common. It's a consequence of climate change. Obviously, as the average temperature heats up, it allows or favors those insects that like it hot, as grasshoppers and bush crickets do. But it tends not to fly or even hop. It kind of crawls a bit like a mouse. So sometimes you can see the vegetation moving because it's quite a large animal, or relatively so. But it's easy to identify because of the long antennae and this yellow base to the saddle on the pronotum here. So just a few pointers in general about insects. Where do you find them? Well, you don't have to look very hard to find them. Pollinating insects will visit flowers. So as we mentioned, look for those. Quite a few other insects like to hide away. They need the moisture. So a great place to find them is to look under logs and stones. You don't have to go far to find them. So just look in your garden or any open space that's near to you. The harder you look, the more you'll find. We mentioned some of the aquatic, both beetles and bugs, and then you've also got dragonflies to add into the mix. Obviously, I have not given you a tour of all insects. We've just concentrated on a few beetles and bugs and just a few others. So there are lots of others out there to explore. If you're keen to look at moths, then a moth trap will just open your eyes to a fantastic array of insects that will visit your garden, but you'll be unaware of because they come in the middle of the night when either you're asleep or it's too dark for you to see them. Just a little tip as well, look around windows, both at night. If you've got the light on, it will attract insects to the lights. You'll see them on the outside of the windows. But if in hot weather like this, you've got windows and doors open and insects fly in, they will then go to the inside of the window to try and escape. So you often find them either at the window, or if they die, then on the windowsill. And if you want to attract more insects, then definitely get into wildlife gardening. So just things to point out when you're out and about. As I said right at the beginning, you'll probably walk past thousands of insects every time you go out for a walk and not necessarily notice them. So you look out for movement, clearly. But check leaves, not just the flowers, and also look under leaves. If you come to a bush or a plant, it's worth just flicking over the leaves very gently, and you often find things underneath it. So a few pointers if you want to kind of get into identifying them. So there's kind of 3 levels to this. So a bit like today, this is just an introduction to some of the commoner species. So if you want to back that up, I would point you to the Leicestershire ID guides, which you can get for free on NatureSpot. And there are all sorts of topics there, but quite a few of them cover insects, as I've summarized there. So you can just download, there's 10 of the commonest species on each sheet. So it's a great place to start. Beyond that, certainly look at the galleries on NatureSpot. And that's why it helps to know what kind of insect it is, because that will narrow down the search. If you want to go a step further and be able to get a better handle on insects, this book came out fairly recently, a few years ago. It's amazing value for money. It's not that expensive. I think it's about £17, but it's quite a tome. Doesn't cover every insect, but is a great introduction to all the different types of insects, and it will cover the majority of insects that you're likely to find. A cheat to finding out what insect you may have is to use an app, and there are quite a few apps there. So you need a photograph. So if you've got a good mobile phone and you're able to take a decent picture, you can do that. But the way I sometimes use it is I take a picture on my camera, bring up the picture on my computer, and then use my phone to point to the screen. And the one I think is one of the best around for insects, and indeed wildlife in general, is one called OBS Identify. It's a free download. So it's kind of good fun to give it a play. Just one word of warning: do not rely totally on what it tells you. It doesn't get everything right, but it's quite a useful pointer. And then if you really want to go to the next level and want to be able to pinpoint exactly what species you've got and go perhaps beyond some of the more obvious ones, then you're really looking to look at some of those fine details, and you need probably the specimen or a really good picture. And you need to use a key that will take you through what to look for and help you rule out what it's not and gradually narrow down the choice. This one which I've highlighted, it's a great resource that's all free. If you just Google Mike's insect keys, it will bring up this URL. There's a chap called Mike Haxton that has brought up to date some well-established and well-respected keys and added illustrations to make them more user-friendly. So he covers a lot of beetles, a lot of bugs, a lot of flies, and a few other groups as well. But also, if you go to NatureSpot under ID Help, the menu right at the top of the screen, there are pages for all of the different types of groups. There's one on beetles, one on bugs, and so on. And again, they point you to good sources, books that you could buy, but a lot of free resources too that you can find on the internet. So if you do want to take it further and want to see more insects, I'd strongly recommend everybody really get themselves a hand lens. They're not expensive. This one's about £10–12. You can get them even cheaper on eBay. You need something that's kind of ×10 minimum. You don't want it too strong. You can get some that have two lenses, a ×10 and perhaps a ×20, but a ×10 is fine. Get used to using it. It's just fantastic for opening a whole new world of these tiny little creatures out there. If you want to kind of see a lot more insects, then nets are a good idea. This one's a sweep net, so it's kind of fairly tough, and it's designed for, as the name suggests, for sweeping it through vegetation. It knocks some of the, not just insects, but small invertebrates that are perhaps in that vegetation into the net, and you can have a closer look. An insect net or a butterfly net is a much more lightweight thing. It's meant to be kind of catching insects on the wing. And then if you're really keen, and again, I couldn't recommend this highly enough, a stereo microscope. Note, it's a stereo microscope, not a standard compound microscope. It has two eyepieces. So it's a bit like binoculars in reverse. You look with both eyes and you get a 3D image of whatever it is you put down here under the microscope. And you can put you put a live insect under, you can put your hand under, you put anything under it. And it's just, it blows your mind. the detail that you can see is fantastic. And they're not expensive. Again, on NatureSpot, we've got a page on microscopes. Brunel microscopes do some really good value ones for a little over £100 for this one. You can pay a lot more for them, like you can for binoculars, for example. And I mentioned a moth trap. This is what it looks like. The light goes on overnight. Most of them come with a weather shield over the top, so you can just leave them out in all weather. Moths are attracted to the light. They get confused. They tumble into the box beneath, and it's a bit like a baffle trap. They fall through the baffle, can't easily get out, and then normally you stack it full of egg boxes on the inside, and after a short while the moth gets fed up of trying to get out, and it just curls up in one of the egg boxes and basically goes to sleep. And so in the morning you can unpack it, take the moths out. They're quite dozy generally during the day, and you get a really good view of it. And typically you would get 200 or 300 species, maybe more, in a bigger garden. So it's quite exciting to explore the kind of hidden wildlife that you have there.